All right, Shannon, I have 1 o'clock. So if you wanna run with it, that would be great.
All right. Well, welcome everybody remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Shannon Connors, and today we have Lindsey Thurman from the USGS Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center presenting Persist in Place or Shift in Space, applying assessments of species adaptive capacity to inform climate adaptation actions. Thank you everybody for tuning in today for our webinar series held in partnership with the National Climate Adaptation Science Center, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I will turn things over to Jeff Horan real quick just to give us a little more information on the Forest Ecology Working Group real quick.
Right, so this climate adaptation for forest-dependent wildlife has really been a collaboration. It's been a collaboration within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service between our Forest Ecology Working Group, our Science Applications Program, our Migratory Birds Program, and the National Conservation Training Center. But this year, we've also been joined by USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, in sponsoring this webinar series. So it has been a lot of fun to put on, and we've really had, I think, just a great group of speakers, and we're continuing with that today. If you want more information about our Forest Ecology Working Group, my email's up on the screen. You can reach out to me. For webinar registration and technical issues, you can reach out to Jim Siegel, and his email is there. So, and also for the Wildlife Society and Society of American Foresters credits, you can reach out to Jim. All right, Shannon, you're up.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, just a few logistical details before we introduce Lindsey. So just as a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all of you are active participants. And whether you're listening by phone or computer, you are currently on mute during the presentation for the enjoyment of others. If you do have a question at any time during the webinar, please go ahead and enter it using the chat box and be sure to send the chat to everyone. And like I said, feel free to enter questions at any point during the presentation. We will pause to take questions about halfway through, and there will be time for questions as well at the end of the webinar. And like I said, the presentation is being recorded and the recording will be available on the webinar gallery in about a week. And if you want to change your presentation view in Zoom, you can access different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of your screen as shown here on this slide. And that's all I have. I'm going to turn things back over to Jeff to give us a little bit more information on the webinar series and to introduce Lindsey. Thanks, Jeff.
Hey, thank you, Shannon. So just many of you folks have been participants in our series now for most of this year. So this is our webinar 9 this time around. And so it's a 12-part series. And so we try to tell a story over that period of time. And in this case, we're talking about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and forest-dependent wildlife. So as you guys have seen, we examine forest ecosystems, we examine their composition and structure under changing climates, and we look at the influence on wildlife populations and also on carbon dynamics. So we also have been trying to share some tools that might be helpful to you. Today, we're going to be looking at a number of those components, but really impacts to how we apply these assessments to species. So go ahead, next slide would be good, Shannon. So today, as we've said, we're going to have Lindsey Thurman talk about persist in place or shift in space, and that's applying assessments of species adaptive capacity to inform climate adaptation actions. But before we get started today, I do want to run a commercial for next month, and that's going to be on Tuesday, January the 17th, and it's at 1 p.m. as always Eastern time, or that would be 9 if you're out there like Lindsey on the Pacific coast. So next month we have can you go back? I forget, it's such an easy title. Climate Adaptation Strategies for Longleaf Pine. And that's with Josh Pulick from the Jones Center. So that should be a great talk as well. Now you can give me the bio. Thanks a lot. So now to introduce our today's speaker, Lindsey Thurman. Lindsey is a partnerships ecologist with the USGS Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or CASC. You can see that she has her PhD and MS in wildlife science, and she also has her BS at University of Florida in wildlife ecology and conservation. Lindsey is a partnership ecologist for the Northwest CASC with expertise in freshwater ecology. She works closely with natural resource managers, conservation planners to identify forward-looking adaptation strategies, including strategies to enhance the adaptive capacity and reduce the risk and vulnerability of at-risk species from climate change. She supports on-the-ground adaptation through her research and on the adaptive capacity of headwater streams associated with amphibians and timber managed lands. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsey, and she can run with things. But I've already heard from a number of our colleagues here in Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have heard Lindsey speak before, so they're pretty excited about hearing today's presentation. Thanks, Lindsey.
Thank you. Just confirm that you're seeing my screen.
We're seeing the whole Monty there, so
the whole shebang. Awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I had no idea I had so many hyphens in that summary statement. So thanks for navigating that. And I'm really honored to be a part of this webinar series. It's been such an excellent series of talks over the last several months. And I thank you guys so much for participating here in the middle of December. I'm sure you've all got holidays on the brain. So hopefully you'll find some education and enjoyment from this talk. And as Jeff mentioned, I'll be focusing in on species adaptive capacity, assessments thereof, and how it informs climate adaptation and broader management and conservation of species. And before I get started, I must acknowledge all of the amazing contribution of my collaborators and colleagues that are a part of our adaptive capacity work group. This effort has been going on for several years. We sort of formally established ourselves back in 2017 through a workshop at the USGS Powell Center. But our work group is just growing exponentially. We've got very engaged and just wonderful membership from various federal and state agencies, universities, and several nonprofit organizations, both within the US as well as abroad in Australia, Europe, Africa. It's just a very growing and diverse group. So I'm really humbled to be leading the charge. So for this presentation, I want to cover three things, and I'll take some breaks in between for questions or sips of coffee. But first and foremost, I want to give you all an overview of adaptive capacity and really focus in on some advancements in our understanding of that concept. Then I'll move in to discuss the assessment framework that our work group has developed. If you've heard this a similar talk from me before, this is the AC wheel of traits. And then for the last part of the talk, I really want to focus in on efforts from our work group to bridge research and practice. And this will, I'll highlight our AC informed adaptation menu, but we've got a lot of other efforts branching off that I hope will help inform conservation practice. So let's kick it off. I want to give you all a quick background on climate change vulnerability in case you're new to this world. Climate change vulnerability assessments are typically and traditionally conducted focusing on three factors: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is referred to as the rate and magnitude of climate change that is experienced, in this case, by species or populations. I will note that vulnerability assessments are also applied to human systems or socio-ecological systems. Sensitivity has been defined in many ways. Typically, I see it referred to as the susceptibility or degree of impact of climate change. So the susceptibility of the species to climate change. I'll talk a bit about how I frame sensitivity in the next slide, which is where this idea of dose response comes in. But together, sensitivity and exposure are typically considered the potential impact of climate change. And then when combined with adaptive capacity, which is the ability of a species to cope with or adjust to climate change, those factors together confer vulnerability. Now, I've been recently involved in the revision. We're getting ready to start the revision of the Nature Serves Climate Change Vulnerability Index. If any of you have used that tool before. So I've started to frame my idea of vulnerability around how that index operates, and it's an algorithm. And so this has helped me kind of understand how I might frame sensitivity and disambiguate it from adaptive capacity, which I hear from a lot of people that is one of the challenges of vulnerability assessments in practice. So I like to describe exposure and sensitivity as a dose-response relationship. And that essentially is the magnitude of the response of an organism as a function of its exposure or dose to a stressor over a certain period of time. This is typically applied to toxicology or pharmacology, but I've co-opted it here for climate change vulnerability. But essentially, it's a measure of how a species is affected at different levels of climate exposure over different time points. So if we think of this diagram here, a species may be more sensitive to extremes than changes in annual conditions. So we may wish to weight those extreme conditions more heavily in our vulnerability assessment or assessment algorithm. And then, of course, as I described earlier, together, exposure and sensitivity make up the potential impact of climate change. And when combined with an assessment of adaptive capacity, this ultimately informs vulnerability. And I'm going to focus in on this adaptive capacity concept, but I wanted to share just kind of describe this broader relationship in a bit more detail, because as I mentioned, that disambiguation between sensitivity and adaptive capacity can confuse a lot of folks, and rightfully so. It still confuses me sometimes. So the IPCC defines adaptive capacity as the potential capability or ability of a species, ecosystem, or human system to adjust to climate change, to moderate potential damage, take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to the consequences. It's a pretty broad strokes definition. And, as I mentioned, this vulnerability assessment framework was kind of born out of more of a social system framing, human risk assessments with respect to climate change. And so we have modified those concepts for biological systems. And I focus in specifically on species. And I'll give you an example here. This is caribou here in North America. This is a paper that came out 2 years ago by Davidson et al. And it's a great example of adaptive capacity. So these caribou mate in the fall, which means they're pregnant in winter, and they raise their young in the spring when food is most abundant. And this schedule is tightly coordinated with environmental patterns. And so this team analyzed, I believe it was 5 caribou populations distributed throughout North America. And they found that populations living in the northernmost Arctic, where things are actually shifting more rapidly due to climate change, these populations were actually having offspring earlier in the spring to coincide with changes in their environment. So this actually suggests that these populations are in fact adapting to climate change through this mechanism of phenological breeding phenology shifts, which is really, really fascinating. And so for the purposes of our work group, we really wanted to better understand adaptive capacity, both in theory and how it's operationalized in practice. So what can we learn from examples like that caribou example that we can standardize or generalize for managers? And I want to just give a quick overview of where we've come in this adaptive capacity framing. Colleagues of mine, my former supervisor, Eric Beaver, and his collaborators led this really foundational paper on adaptive capacity back in 2016. And they presented the concept of adaptive capacity through the lens of the ecological niche. So if you think back to, your early education, the niche concept is framed around the fundamental versus realized niche. And the fundamental niche here is an analogy for the fundamental adaptive capacity of a species. That is their innate or intrinsic ability to cope with or adjust to changes in their environment. And in the context of climate change, we know that climate change and other extrinsic stressors on the species can constrain that fundamental adaptive capacity. And so what we measure in reality is more like their realized adaptive capacity. And so building off of that theoretical framing, we developed this attribute-based framework for evaluating species adaptive capacity, and framed it under this idea of whether they can persist in place and or shift in space. And I'll touch on that in more detail. I just wanted to note here that I do have these QR codes. And if you want to come back to this presentation later, or even during the talk, you can hover your camera over those and it'll link you to these papers from our work group. So broadly, what does this persist in place or shift in space mean? It means that species can either adapt in situ, in place, and acclimate to climate change, or they can shift in space and move across the landscape to track suitable climate. And for some unfortunate species, they don't really have the capacity to do either, and this can result in, local or even range-wide extinction. But we're not really going to focus on that depressing part. So I want to give you two examples, one for the persist in place pathway of adaptive capacity and one for the shift in space. This is another great paper by Eric Beaver and his collaborators, and they focused in on behavioral flexibility as one mechanism for coping with climate change, and specifically focused in on mammal species. Behavioral flexibility is a big part of adaptive capacity. It, along with other mechanisms for phenotypic plasticity and evolutionary adaptation, and then species movement or dispersal capacity, are sort of the big level adaptive capacity pathways. And so they did this really great review and quantified different patterns in behavioral response to climate change across different mammal taxa, different timescales, climate stressors, you name it, and found a real breadth of response strategies. So I encourage you to check out that paper. It's really interesting. And one of the most compelling examples, or maybe even charismatic examples from that paper and from Eric's work, is this example of the American pika. This species is capable of pretty marked behavioral plasticity, including their ability to thermoregulate, at least to some degree, by changing their body posture. And so they found that in the northern portion of their range, pikas are more frequently observed with this spherical body shape. If you go back to your lessons on surface area to volume and heat in physics, and then in winter, and so that's a winter strategy or northern, strategy to conserve heat. And then in summer, their body shape stretches out. Eric likes to say it's Club Med pika, and they become more oblong to release that body heat. So these are really cool strategies, and a lot of species exhibit these these thermoregulatory behavioral patterns to cope with at least some degree of, in this case, warming. Now, shift in space is a pretty amazing phenomenon. This paper is actually hot off the press. I just found it the other day and had to include it in this talk. It's a really cool study that looked at about 250 bird species here in North America. And they looked at shifts in their distribution over about a 40-year time period and compared those observed range shifts to modeled range shifts, to see if there was matching in what we predict versus what we observe. And they actually found that the observed distribution of birds over this 40 years and that observed range shift was rarely in alignment with what they modeled using these bioclimatic niche models. And simply, this just means that the bird abundances, their center of abundance over time, didn't align with the changes we expect from climate niche models. And they explained these differences primarily by the role that migratory behaviors and other adaptive capacity attributes play in determining where species move and how quickly. And I thought this is the first time I've really seen such a clear articulation of the importance of adaptive capacity and species biology, life history, ecology in modeling and really observing these range shifts. So what they also said was that they found that temperate or short distance migrants, wetland species and habitat generalists tended to have a higher velocity of observed range shifts than other species. And here you can see in this figure, it's a bit messy, but this is just an observed versus modeled comparison of temperate migratory birds and their movement. So you'll notice the red arrows, which is their observed range shift, is much longer and in different directions than the modeled. So they think, they kind of hypothesize that there's a big role for other, physiological tolerances and access to refugia and other factors that play into the species' adaptive capacity that can really help explain some of these differences in range shifts. So another really cool paper. So we're kind of building on this idea of traits, right? Like we can understand species adaptive capacity through different attributes or traits. And a paper from members of our work group came out a couple of years back, and they wanted to start to really build this table of attributes so that we can move towards an assessment framework. And they identified 7 general characteristics of a species that likely confer greater adaptive capacity. Things like greater genetic diversity, those ecological generalists with broad spatial distributions. And ironically, anytime I present on this, people are like, so invasive species, right? Because these are like very obvious characteristics of prolific invaders like the green crab here. And that's definitely an interesting perspective and totally accurate. And we've actually plucked many of these adaptive capacity attributes from the invasion biology literature. But we try not to focus too much on invasive species. So I'm going to just take a quick pause in case anybody wants to ask a question. I'm going to take a sip of water and just give us a second, and then I'll move into the second part of our presentation here.
So Lindsey, that you're definitely teasing us with some cool stuff, but there was one question very quick in there from Mark, and there are some showing up. But I think when you were talking about shift in space, and he was asking about is red actual versus blue modeled in your graph? Is that
yes?
There you go.
Yeah, I plucked that from their supplement. They provided those same graphs for the different guilds of species that they looked at, so you can check that out in more detail in their supplement. The boreal bird species was also a very compelling graph as well.
Okay, so there's some good questions here, but this one is so Daniel asked, why shy away from invasive species when looking at persisting in place or shifting in space?
Yeah, I don't think you have to necessarily shy away from it. I think we just know for the more prolific invaders that I don't think you really need to do an AC assessment to know that they're going to spread and do well. And so, really this AC tool that I'm going to share with you is presented as a way to identify different management opportunities for a species. And I think for many invasive species, we already sort of know what those management opportunities or mitigation strategies are.
Well, just to follow up on that invasive, I mean, do we know a timeline for when that velocity, much like you were talking about for the shifting in space, when an invasive species velocity begins to slow once, maybe parts of our ecosystem catch up? Can we calibrate that?
Probably. That's a little bit out of my area of expertise. I know we can, like I'm thinking of the invasive emerald ash borer, right, that we just found out here in the Northwest.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, right. There's a couple decades of work on that species already and its invasive trajectory across, North America from east to west coast. And I think we can learn a lot about the pace of that invasion. I've not seen that yet translated to anything to do with adaptive capacity. It's just not really framed in that way.
All right,
Yeah.
thanks for sharing. We'll let
Sure.
you get back to your assessment
Okay.
framework and talk about the AC wheel, and then we'll pick up. There's lots of questions coming in, so people
Yeah,
are
I'll take another
engaged. So
break
we'll,
after this, just
okay.
to, in case there's anything missing. Yep.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay.
Okay, without further ado, the AC wheel. Just kidding. More background. So for the adaptive capacity framework, we demonstrated its applicability in our paper, which is linked down there in the bottom right if you want to take a look at it. But we approached it through the use of 2 illustrative species for each of 4 functional groups. So we looked at migratory species, species with complex life cycles, ectothermic vertebrates, and sessile species, just to showcase a diversity of species with a range of adaptive capacity, as well as situations in which species may have, deal breaker or Achilles heel attributes, or even deal maker attributes. And of course, examples in which practitioners may be faced with limited data availability, which is a reality for most. So the wheel of traits, or attributes, because they're not all necessarily traits per se, we call them attributes. There's 36 of them. I'll move my cursor here. They are grouped into 7 complexes, which relate to species distribution, their movement, their evolutionary potential, their ecological role, abiotic niche, life history, and demography. For some species, you may not need to assess all of the traits. For example, there's 4 traits related to migration, so not applicable to non-migratory species. But we do identify 12 core attributes that are highlighted here in light blue. And those are the ones that we suggest if you have either limited time or resources or information. An assessment of these 12 attributes can provide you with a pretty comprehensive overview of that species' adaptive capacity. And when you're filling out the table, you'll reference this criteria table, and it's I'll walk you through it real quick. Essentially, we have a row here for each of the 36 attributes. We then describe whether or not that attribute relates to the species' ability to persist in place or shift in space. For some attributes, like extent of occurrence here, it relates to both. We provide you with a definition or an overview of its relevance to adaptive capacity. The relevant scale of assessment, for some, it's at the species level. For other attributes, it can be at even the population level or specific life stage. There are also, for some attributes, additional specifications that can, bifurcate that assessment. So you will have a different set of criteria for example, mobile versus sessile species, or animals versus plants. And so we provide that distinction as well. And then you have your AC criteria, and this is on a scale from low to high. For a given attribute, you'll either assess 3 criteria, low, moderate, and high, or 4, which breaks down moderate into moderately low versus moderately high. And then you fill out the table, right? For each attribute, you say, okay, here's the level of adaptive capacity. Unfortunately, this is for the rufous hummingbird. There's not a ton of information on climatic niche breadth. So this was actually evaluated as unknown for this particular attribute. But you do the equivalent of a literature review on the topic, and then you fill in your information, and you also have the opportunity to provide the strength of evidence. And so, for example, for this one, there just really wasn't, even though it looks like there's a ton of information, there really wasn't a ton of information specific to this attribute. And what results is this wheel of fortune, or misfortune, some call, of adaptive capacity for a species. And the wheel, the spokes in the wheel are color coded here by the level of adaptive capacity, high being blue, low being red. And then the length of the spoke in the wheel indicates the strength of evidence. So longer spokes indicate greater evidence in support of that attribute's assessment. We also provide a smaller summary graph here, which basically just arrays the attributes from high to low AC, and then by the strength of evidence, just to give you a nice visualization of the overall adaptive capacity of the species. And if you've heard me give a talk like this before, you'll know that I emphasize that we do not provide a composite score of AC, because when we built this, feedback from managers said, we don't know what to do with a score. a 4 out of 5 AC doesn't really mean a whole lot to us unless we're ranking and comparing hundreds of species. And so really our intention here was to encourage users of this framework to make those comparisons across different attribute groups. You know, here, for example, we can look in on this abiotic niche group and see that there's just no information on their behavioral flexibility, their physiological tolerance, you know, the rufous hummingbird's climatic niche breadth. I mean, that is so critically important to understand, excuse me, their climate change vulnerability. And if you had a score, you wouldn't really be able to get at that information very clearly. So just to share with you where we've gone with this, I've got a project here in the Northwest with state fish and wildlife agencies in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We're conducting adaptive capacity assessments on approaching 50 species, and that includes some that we did through a vulnerability assessment in partnership with Sayusla National Forest. So our list of species is growing, and we're going to have an online repository. I'm in the process of developing a website that will be a one-stop AC shop for doing these assessments online, walking through our adaptation menu, accessing a repository of all the assessments that at least I've been a part of or our workgroup collaborators. So that's all to come in early next year is our hope, or at least by mid next year is my hope. So stay tuned for that, but we've just got a great diversity of species. And I'm happy to share that information with you if you're interested. And if you're interested in doing an AC assessment, you can access this quick reference guide that I put together. This link here is to a Google folder, and it includes this how-to guide, all of the materials you need to do an assessment, including a template table, the criteria table, and then background resources such as the papers. And we even now include our adaptation menu. And this is all available also on our SharePoint site if you're in DOI. Okay, I'm going to take a break for another round of questions if we have any.
So there aren't a ton of questions right now, but I will ask though, of your 48 species, are they, you know, so you're located in the Northwest and you're focused out of the Northwest Climate Science Center. So, but are these 48 species throughout the whole country, you know, working with colleagues, or is it more West Coast focused, Lindsey?
Yeah, so this project is specific to the Western US. It's about species, pretty much the Rockies and West. But this only represents about half of the species we've done assessments for. And I participate pretty frequently in species status assessments, and those are for species all over the US. We've had some international assessments done. So this is only a subset of them.
Okay, no, that's great. And do you think, you know, it'll be in the form of an atlas? How are you thinking that, you know, how, and is this something, you know, that biologists are going to be able to just reach up and you know, look at these, you know, attributes and traits and be able to apply to management decisions they are making, you know, on their refuges or you know, on their national forests, et cetera?
Yeah, my hope is my plan is to have a searchable database online so that you can go in and search by taxa or for specific species and have the equivalent of like a spreadsheet where if you wanted to do a great synthesis across, say, all amphibians that have had an AC assessment done, you could do analyses on traits across those species. So I want it to be open access as best as possible so that it's easily queryable and downloadable. And so that's what we're working towards. And yeah, and I'll explain more about the links to the adaptation menu in the next part.
Okay, well, we'll let you go to that. There are other questions here, but we'll wait and take them.
Okay. Yeah, we should have plenty of time at the end for questions. I've tried to keep this succinct, concise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, this last part of the talk is really focused on our efforts to bridge research and practice, and the highlight of that being this AC informed adaptation menu that we recently developed. If I can go back to this figure here and just remind you that we're building on these theoretical and conceptual advancements, and we've moved more towards implementation. So how this information is used in practice. We've got a paper coming out that's led by one of my CASC colleagues, Laura Thompson, and she's focused in on that one pie slice of the wheel, which is evolutionary potential. And we've tried to really unravel all the complexity of evaluating evolutionary potential. Some call it evolutionary adaptive capacity, which is the same thing. And really get at, what are proxies for measuring that? What can you do with certain information? And so that'll be a great resource moving forward if you're interested in the topic of evolution. And to really focus in on this adaptation side of things, we've got this menu that we developed, and our perspective on that was born out of this idea that there are opportunities for directly enhancing species adaptive capacity. That's this bottom blue loop here in this figure. And a lot of those actions that directly enhance species adaptive capacity are those genetic-based actions. And then there are also, so the idea there, sorry, forgot another animation. The idea there being that if you can affect or enhance species adaptive capacity, then you're shrinking the influence of climate change and other stressors. There's also another pathway that you can take, and that is the pathway up here at the top. And there are several management actions that can be taken to indirectly affect species adaptive capacity through reducing their exposure or sensitivity, or reducing the effects of other extrinsic stressors. So there's sort of two ways to come at this. I'll also note, for those of you that are coming at this from more of a research side of things, we recently came out with a paper that provides some lessons learned for researchers in that sort of eco-evolutionary world to better support integration of their theory into practice. So we're really trying to better operationalize this concept of adaptive capacity for practitioners. So let's dive into adaptation menu. And I want to present this to you through the general adaptation process. If you're familiar with climate smart conservation, this is the cycle, the adaptation cycle. And I've tried to integrate the adaptive capacity stuff as best as possible. But this adaptation process typically always starts with, informing the process, setting your goals and objectives. And then we recommend that you assess your climate vulnerabilities and risks. And this can now include a comprehensive assessment of adaptive capacity. With that information in hand, you can then evaluate the implications of that vulnerability assessment for your management goals. And in our adaptation menu paper, we talk about there's 3 different ways essentially to frame your management goals based on a species adaptive capacity assessment. So the idea there is to determine whether or not there are opportunities to directly enhance the species AC. And as I mentioned, it's a lot of genetic-based stuff. So, maintaining or maximizing genetic diversity, looking at climate-adjusted or non-local provenancing, which is proposed commonly in is being more commonly proposed in the plant world, supporting that behavioral flexibility, et cetera. And then there are other opportunities to indirect species adaptive capacity. And then, of course, managing exposure or sensitivity when there really are no opportunities to directly or indirectly affect adaptive capacity. So these are kind of like 3 high-level ways of thinking through this adaptation menu. And we always encourage people to think about whether or not this adaptive capacity assessment reveals opportunities for the species to persist in place or shift in space. Because that can help kind of guide where you go in this adaptation menu. If it looks like the species, for like many amphibian species that I work on, they really don't have a capacity to shift in space. So we are frequently looking at conservation actions to protect them where they currently exist. And so, for example, we may walk into this adaptation menu looking specifically at the evolutionary potential group of attributes and associated adaptation actions. And I'll describe that in more detail next. But the last part of this adaptation cycle centers around implementation and tracking and monitoring the response of your species. And for some, you complete the loop and start over if it looks like things are changing. But this is essentially how the AC stuff fits into this general adaptation process. And now the menu, as I mentioned, we're bringing it online. So this is sort of a sneak peek of what I hope to create online for everyone. But this adaptation menu is available through the supplement of our paper and in that quick reference folder that I shared with you. But so we've grouped these adaptation actions by the attribute complexes or attribute groups. So let's say you're interested in the evolutionary potential group of adaptation actions. You could go in and look at actions specific to genetic diversity, which would present a list of adaptation actions. And let's say you're then interested in things that help protect or enhance connectivity to facilitate gene flow. And this is a common tool in a manager's toolbox. That was intentional. We wanted to present, both novel and traditional actions in our menu. And so, if you hone in on this connectivity one, then you're presented with a more detailed explanation of that action and some examples of the types of goals you may have in your management plan or conservation plan, such as, reducing the potential for genetic drift or minimizing the risk of disease transmission when, trying to optimize connectivity. There's some trade-offs there. And then for each of the actions, we provide examples for you. And these are real on-the-ground examples. Many of them are through DOI, through Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service. We tried to limit the more theoretical, journal publications that don't have a lot of real tangible on-the-ground implementation type applications. So these are meant to be real on-the-ground examples for you. So that's all available through our adaptation menu. And I just real quickly wanted to share that this is just the beginning of us trying to work through this adaptation menu with our partners. It will require significant right sizing. So, these adaptation actions are pretty high level, and for a given species, it's going to look very differently depending on, the policy constraints or the other portfolio of management considerations that a practitioner has to deal with. And so we are in the process of planning 2 workshops. One is with WDFW. We'll be focusing in specifically on their state wildlife action plan revision and how this AC assessment framework and adaptation menu can help support their species of greatest conservation need and revisions to that SWAP. And then we're also, I will be participating and helping lead some training for the grassland ecosystem team in January. Some of you might be participating in that, and we'll be integrating all of this AC stuff into other adaptation tools like the Resist, Accept, Direct framework and climate scenarios. And then of course, NIAX has a phenomenal adaptation workbook and menu that will be trying to cross-reference and integrate using some case studies of grassland species. So there's a lot of good to come out of this, and hopefully we'll just increase our utility of these AC tools. If you're looking for other references that contain information on adaptive capacity, I recently helped contribute to the AFWA's voluntary guidance for states to include information on climate adaptation into their SWAPs. That is a beautiful new version that is now available online. And I'll be helping with the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, which we've recently kicked off. And then if you work in the world of species status assessments with Fish and Wildlife Service, we have an FAQ on how to link this AC assessment into the SSA process through the lens of those 3 R's. And we focused in specifically on representation. So those resources are available online. And then the FAQ for SSAs is available through your branch of species status, species BSSS. I will someday get that acronym correct. But as I mentioned earlier in response to one of Jeff's questions, we've got a just exponential growth in the number of species that we are assessing. And we're at about 70 species or more. And next year we'll be doing just a ton more. I've got slated. So this is really motivating me to get this repository online so that it is open access for all of you to query and learn from. So if you are at all interested in training on adaptive capacity or developing other guidance in cooperation with myself or others, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are really excited to do so. We love work. I love workshops. I love helping with workshops and seeing this get used. So don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and take questions.
Wow, so that's great, Lindsey. There's some nice compliments in the chat as well, and again, you really laid it out very nicely. So there's a tremendous amount. The adaptation menu and the whole framework and the adaptive capacity wheel, it really is pretty easy to grasp. Although you presented just a ton of information, so I know
it's a lot. Yeah,
it's a ton of stuff. So I will go back there. There are quite a few questions, and there's some that I missed, and some I skipped intentionally. But there was. Let me see. I'm going back here just to grab a couple from up top, and then I'll move down through. I kind of lost the one I was looking. Oh yeah. So this one is from Bruce Marcotte, and he was, along the kind of eco-evolutionary line of things when you were getting into genetic components. He asked, what evidence do you have to test predictions of changes in genetic adaptation? Again, what evidence do you have to test predictions of changes in genetic adaptation?
So what evidence do we have for the evolutionary adaptation of species? I think that's kind of what we're getting at.
Yeah, it was in the species context, certainly. So,
well, I can give you an example here that I decided not to include in the presentation, but it's a really compelling example. It's looking at pink salmon. They had 32 years of, oh, did I stop sharing?
You did.
Okay. Well, I'll just verbalize it then. They basically have like 30 plus years of genetic data. It was like 17 or so generations of this pink salmon, and they were able to uncover evidence for directional selection towards earlier migration timing in that species, which essentially means they were able to look at a specific genetic marker for migration timing and found that there was substantial change in that genetic marker indicating earlier migration timing in that species, and linked it directly to ocean warming. So there are ways. The genetic side of looking at adaptation is quite complex. If you're familiar with genomic-based selection studies, I mean, this is an area that my husband works in that just kind of like blows my mind because it's complicated but amazing. So there's evidence out there. And it requires a lot of resources, though, I think, and it's more so available for species that, like salmon, obviously, that receive a lot of conservation dollars. But yeah, I mean, if that's something that you're interested in, reach out to me because I have other examples. And I think there's information in the literature is growing towards framing a lot of those genetic studies towards adaptive capacity. So hopefully that kind of got at your question.
Oh yeah, no, I think that probably fit that pretty well. So here's a question from Andrew, and he's mentioning, how species may vary across jurisdictions and may vary, and jurisdictions may have various conservation goals. So species attributes are not uniform across their range, is a statement. Would it make sense to conduct local/regional analysis of these instead of, so maybe that's the context is, what is the temporal aspect of this kind of analysis?
The spatial and temporal aspect of analysis is intentionally flexible. So I'll give you an example of the spatial flexibility in it. So we recently completed an assessment for the American pika. We did a comparison of a range-wide assessment. If you're familiar with the species, it is a very widespread species, but it exists in sort of these isolated mountain ranges across North America. And so we did an adaptive capacity assessment range-wide and compared it to assessments at smaller scales. So we looked at ecoregions, and then we also looked at different lineages, subspecies, and compared, and the outcome was quite different. And that really speaks to the difference in the species ecology. So, you know, it exists across very diverse ecoregions, and obviously has different climate-related threats. So it was nice to see that the AC framework could accommodate that, and that it was informative at different scales. As far as temporal scales go, it's a pretty fixed assessment as far as time scale goes. We build in a lot of eco-evolutionary components to the framework so that you are looking at trends like, for example, in genetic diversity, in population size, and range size, so forth. But to really capture changes in adaptive capacity over time, you would have to repeat the assessment or incorporate specific monitoring parameters into your adaptation effort. Like if you wanted to keep track of genetic diversity changes over time, that would have to be explicit to your adaptation plan.
Okay, no, thanks a lot. And also thanks so much, Lindsey, for the invitation. I suspect there are people that will take you up on your invitation for the training components of this tool. I suspect that folks that I work with would be very interested. So along that same line, here's a question about the 48 species that you have adaptive assessments for. So do the adaptive capacity assessments for the 48 species shown relate to fundamental or realized AC? And how would you take the next step and assess realized AC?
I would say it probably more accurately reflects, it depends. For some of the attributes, I would say it more accurately reflects their fundamental adaptive capacity. And that would be things like genetic diversity, other life history and demographic attributes. For other things like their range size, their area of occupancy, their rarity on the landscape, other things to do with the potential influence of, you know, humans, basically, that probably better reflects realized adaptive capacity. So there isn't a clear articulation in the framework whether it reflects fundamental or realized. That is more of a conceptual framing, just to wrap your mind around the fact that adaptive capacity can be constrained by, you know, extrinsic influences.
Well, I have to say, I like the way you answered that, because you kind of went around your wheel and how you're thinking about it. So I can see, you know, you can see how you're using these components. And I think that in and of itself is a very important point. So here's a few specific questions that usually you can answer quickly. So here's, you know, James says he's working with the Forest Service in Northern California. And so he's asking, is the northern spotted owl one of your 48 species or a priority species?
Not yet. We have not done the northern spotted owl. I'm trying to remember. We have done one owl species, and I know for a fact it was not northern spotted. But I'd be happy to share. Oh, it was the great gray. That's right, great gray owl. And I'm happy to share the list of species that we have done online. Only a subset of them are available through USGS Science Base. And I can share that link as well. We're basically going through a review process right now for those 48 species. So those should be up within the next couple of months.
Cool. All right. And so here's Andrew saying, I work in cumulative effects assessments where climate change needs to be included. And again, we have lots of our refuges that are looking at these, and I'm sure there are other land managers. How do you untangle landscape, land and land use change from climate change in assessing specifically sensitivity and adaptive capacity? You explained some of that, but you know.
Yeah, I don't know that you really can untangle it. I mean, so from the perspective of doing an AC assessment, you're really evaluating the species' ability to cope with change of any kind, although some of the criteria are very specific to climate, right? But when it comes to things like looking at species diet breadth, or how, they have biotic interactions, how, do they have any mutualisms or other obligate relationships? And that kind of information is applicable beyond just linking it to climate change impacts. But there isn't really anything built into the assessment framework explicitly that would allow you to switch what your threat of interest is. It's pretty solidly linked to climate change. But that being said, understanding the species' adaptive capacity in the context of climate change can inform how it responds to other stressors. So it's not like that information isn't translational.
Okay, I'm going to give you a couple questions at once because they're not all that different. I will say first that Ginger is saying, hey, her doctoral research is on this, but this really is, she's complementing your framework.
Oh.
So Amber asked a similar question that we asked before, and that was related to, are the AC assessments being applied outside of the Pacific Northwest? And then
Definitely.
I'm going to pile on here and saying, this is Orion saying, wondering if you have applied AC assessments to multi-species associations, species groups, plant communities, or ecosystems, for instance, or is this not as feasible because species tend to respond to climate change individualistically?
Oh, well, I can give you a sneak peek. I haven't really shared this with anyone yet, but this is a question I've gotten for the last 6 years, and my brain wheels are always spinning. And we've got a few people in our work group who are interested in this, pursuing this idea. And that is, what does it mean to scale up an adaptive capacity assessment from species to communities to ecosystems? And I've been in the process of brainstorming what that assessment framework might look like. And I've been pulling from landscape ecology and complex adaptive systems and all these other bodies of theory to start to build out some quote unquote attributes that would allow us to assess the adaptive capacity of whole ecosystems. So more on that to come. And that is a very complex topic. I think a lot about how my background, actually, my PhD looked at ecological networks and eco-evolutionary dynamics. And so I'm very interested in this, in pursuing this topic. And if you're also interested, reach out, because I would love to have input. I'm just about ready to share sort of the skeleton of my ideas with folks. So this is on the horizon for me, definitely.
All right, that sounds like good timing. So this is a very specific question from Amanda. What is the chance you've assessed white bark pine? Now, you were talking mostly about critters, so okay.
We have, yeah, we've gotten a few plants and trees in the queue, and we have done the white bark pine, and that is a part of, I'm trying to remember which project that was a part of. Yeah, that's a part of our Species for the Northwest projects, so that will be coming out very soon. And I should mention, I did not do all of these assessments. I've reviewed them all and I've participated in them all, but we have experts, multiple folks per assessment. And so this has been a huge effort.
That's all right. Today is all about giving you the credit, so that's just fine.
me, right?
So again, lots of folks are really appreciating the presentation here. So, and then, similar to the white bark pine, this is Brenda McComb, who has helped us a great deal putting on these series, and she is out in Oregon as well. And so there you go. So will you also be including plant species in your assessment? Clearly.
Yes, definitely. We've done terrestrial, marine, and freshwater invertebrates, plants, trees, you name it. We haven't done like a fungus or anything yet, but
yeah, this one I don't think is answerable, but maybe you have an answer to it. But so AC will be playing out. This is Jeff Burgett saying AC will be playing out against the actual changing climate going forward. Mm-hmm. How do you advise practitioners to calibrate your results against projected future conditions? Again, yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah, that's a tough one because this assessment really is a snapshot in time. It takes into account a lot of historical change. If you think, for example, with population size, built into that assessment is questions surrounding, if there have been bottlenecks, if there have been local extinctions. And so it offers that somewhat of a temporal perspective, but as far as forecasting, the best I can say is that this assessment provides you with a snapshot of how the species is currently doing and how it may cope or adjust through time. But I think with any given climate assessment, you really have to understand what their thresholds of tolerance are and how future climate change might exceed those tolerances. And that requires a more empirical based assessment, I think.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And so this is kind of along this. So this is still on the practitioner side. And this is Orion saying, if conservation practitioners complete an AC assessment using the tool, is there a way to capture that work in your database so others don't have to start from scratch? So,
yes.
Or will that be coming in the future?
Yeah, that's what we're bringing online. I'm developing a Shiny app, if you're familiar with that. And it'll be a website where we'll have this repository and searchable database so that if a species has been evaluated, it will be on there. The limiting factor is I have to be aware of it, right? Because I'll be running that website. This is sort of evolving into people doing it themselves and not contacting me and not letting me know. And so I'll have to figure out a way to if they go to our website to do the assessment, I will try to figure out a way to get them to upload it and make it publicly available if possible.
Yeah, let the lady behind the curtain know what's going on. So
right, yeah.
You can pull the levers. Okay.
I don't want to micromanage, but it would be nice to have it all openly available.
It sounds like, yeah, but I think the collaboration is appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
So, so here's similar. This is from Bruce. Have you advised managers on appropriate interpretations of potential false positives and false negatives of the AC predictions?
I'm not sure how I would qualify false positives or negatives in this context. I mean, really, I approach any conversation with managers and any workshop or training situation that this is meant to be a conversation framework. I mean, this is meant to guide conversation. It's not meant to say that this species absolutely will fail under climate change or absolutely will thrive. It's meant to help figure out what aspects of their species adaptive capacity you can focus in on and can capitalize on or need to triage. And so there aren't necessarily specific outcomes that indicate yes or no or positive or negative. So I'm not sure how to really answer that effectively.
So here's an interesting one from Dorothy. And again, we are at 2:03, so we'll just take a couple more questions because we like to wrap up pretty close to 2. But I can see people are engaged, so we'll take a couple more. But this one's from Dorothy, and she's getting into the micro world, and I think it's a pretty important question. Fungi, she says, fungi are so important to forest health. It would be important to include them in the future. Is there, I know there are people looking a lot.
Oh, definitely.
Mycorrhizae and such, but is there a way to include that in some of the, in the wheel, for instance?
Yeah, I don't see why they would be excluded. I think what would be helpful is if someone really is focused on fungi to look through the framework and identify areas where maybe they could fit in some specific verbiage related to fungi, like anything to do with their life history, how they reproduce. I don't know that language is captured well in the framework. There is a bias towards vertebrates and plants and invertebrates. So if that's something that you're really interested in, please don't hesitate to look through the framework and let me know if there's ways we can improve.
Okay, and so I think we're going to try to close things out here, but I will take this one from Karuna, and this, for folks that aren't all stuck inside the US of A. Do you think the AC framework would be helpful for evidence-based species adaptation planning outside of the US?
Yeah, definitely. We're pretty involved with the IUCN climate change work group. And so we're trying to, broaden its utility outside of the US and use it in all sorts of vulnerability frameworks. As I mentioned, I'm helping with the update to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index. And so that has a lot of use outside of the US as well. So yes.
That's great. So again, and there's lots of folks here thanking you for a great and well presented discussion.
Absolutely.
So thanks again for that, Lindsey,
Thank you.
and thanks to all our participants. I will remind folks that there will be a recording of this. It'll be up. We also have Lindsey's presentation, so there'll be a PDF available, and it's up on the NIAC site, and all our flyers have that link, and Shannon had shared it as well. So again, thanks to Lindsey, and thanks to everyone who participated, and hope we talk to you on January 17th. Thanks so much, Lindsey, and everybody have a great day.
Happy
and a
holidays.
a great holiday too. Yeah, exciting times. Thanks, Lindsey. That was awesome.
Thank you.